On a cold, quiet evening in a small neighborhood, a police officer was making his usual rounds. The streets were mostly empty, with only the occasional car passing by. But something caught his eye. A girl, no older than 8 or 9, was sitting alone on the swings at an old, abandoned playground. It wasn't common to see children outside alone at this time, especially not in a place like this. As the officer slowed down his patrol car and observed her, he noticed that she wasn't playing or enjoying herself. Instead, she seemed distant, almost as if she was waiting for someone or looking for something. The officer, who had been on the force for many years, knew how important it was to check on situations like this. He parked his car a little further away and walked over to the playground. As he got closer, he could see that the little girl's clothes were worn out and dirty, like she had been outside for a while. Her face was sad, and she didn't seem to notice him approaching. The air was chilly, and he could tell she was cold, but she didn't move or shiver much. There was something in her eyes, a kind of sadness that made the officer stop in his tracks for a moment. He approached her slowly, making sure to not startle her. He bent down to her level, trying to make her feel comfortable. "Hey there," he said in a calm voice. "Are you all right? Where's your mom or dad?" The girl hesitated before looking up at him, her eyes a little wide, but not fearful. She seemed confused at first, unsure of how to react to the stranger in a police uniform. After a moment, she slowly spoke. I'm waiting for my mom," she said quietly, her voice trembling. The officer gently asked if she had been waiting long and where her mom was, but the girl just looked away, her face still sad. She didn't seem to want to say much more. But there was something about her response that made the officer feel uneasy. The way she spoke, as if she wasn't sure when her mom would show up, made him wonder if something more serious was going on. The officer sat down next to her on the swing, hoping that she might feel more at ease with him. "Do you come here often?" he asked. "This playground is kind of quiet." The girl nodded, but her gaze stayed fixed on the ground. She didn't seem to be in a hurry to go anywhere. The officer could tell that this wasn't just a normal case of a child being left at the playground by accident. Something wasn't right. He decided to talk to her a little more, gently probing without pushing her. After a while, the girl looked up at him again, her eyes still sad, but with a sense of trust beginning to form. Slowly, she started to speak more freely. She told the officer that she had been staying with her mom, but things had gotten difficult. Her mom had been sick, and they didn't have a stable home anymore. They moved from place to place, and sometimes she had to be on her own, trying to stay out of trouble. But today, her mom had left her alone, and she didn't know where to go or who to turn to. As she spoke, the officer's heart broke. No child should have to live like this, wandering from place to place, trying to survive without a home or safety. The weight of her words hit him hard. It wasn't just about a lost child. This was about a little girl who had been struggling for far too long, trying to make sense of a world that was too big and too scary for her to handle on her own. The officer took a deep breath. He had seen many difficult situations over his years of service, but this one felt different. The sadness in her eyes, the way she was just trying to survive, it hit close to home. His job was to help people, but this felt personal. He knew he couldn't just walk away from this. This girl needed help, and he wasn't going to leave her alone. Not now. Not ever. The officer could feel his emotions starting to rise. This little girl, sitting there all alone, clearly had been through more than any child should ever have to face. Her story was heartbreaking, yet there was something in her calmness, her quiet strength, that made him want to do everything in his power to help her. He couldn't just leave her there, not in this situation. As much as he wanted to take her in his arms and promise everything would be okay, he knew there was more work to do. He had to make sure she was safe and get her the help she so desperately needed. He gently placed his hand on her shoulder. "I'm really sorry you've been going through all of this," he said softly. "I want to make sure you're okay. I'm going to help you." She looked up at him, her eyes still filled with the sadness that seemed to have been there for a long time. The officer could tell that she wasn't used to being helped. He knew it would take time to get her to trust him fully, but he was determined. After a moment of silence, the officer stood up and spoke into his radio. He requested backup and immediately called for social services, knowing that this situation required professional help. He made sure they knew how urgent it was. "I found a little girl out here in the playground. She's alone, and her mom is nowhere to be found. She says they've been living on the streets." His voice was calm, but there was an edge of urgency behind it. This was more than just a missing child. It was a matter of safety, and that was something the officer took very seriously. While he waited for the social workers and backup to arrive, he stayed by her side. The cold wind blew, and the officer noticed that she wasn't wearing much to keep warm. He had a spare jacket in his car, so he quickly went to grab it and returned to give it to her. "Here, this will help keep you warm until the other officers get here," he said. She accepted it hesitantly at first, almost as if she wasn't used to anyone being kind to her. But once the jacket was on, she seemed a little more at ease. The officer sat next to her again, not saying much at first. He wanted her to feel like she wasn't alone. They both just sat there quietly, the only sound being the wind and the distant hum of city traffic. The officer couldn't help but think about how many other children were out there, struggling in silence. How many people had walked by, never stopping to ask if they were okay. It was moments like these that reminded him of the deep responsibility he had as a police officer, not just to enforce the law, but to protect and care for the most vulnerable in society. After what felt like an eternity, a social worker and a few other officers finally arrived. They quickly took over, speaking to the girl in a way that made her feel safe and reassured. The officer stood back for a moment, watching as they comforted her and asked her more questions. He knew she would be in good hands now, but it was still hard to see her go. The bond they had started to form, even in those few short minutes, was something special. He had made a difference, at least for one person, and that was all he could ask for. As the social worker led the girl away, she turned to the officer and gave him a small, uncertain smile. "Thank you," she whispered. Her words were simple, but they meant everything. The officer nodded, his own eyes welling up with emotion. He didn't say much, just a quiet, "You're welcome." Then he watched as she was taken to safety, knowing that her life had just been changed in a way that would give her a better chance at a future. The officer stood there for a while, letting the moment sink in. His heart ached for all the children who were struggling like this. But in that moment, he knew that sometimes doing the right thing didn't require grand gestures. It was about being there when someone needed help the most and showing them that they weren't alone. And that, he believed, was what truly made a difference. The officer stood in the playground for a while, his thoughts racing. He couldn't shake the image of the young girl sitting there, alone in the cold, her eyes filled with a kind of sadness he couldn't easily forget. He'd seen many things in his years on the job, but this was different. Her story had stuck with him, and he knew he couldn't let it go. As the minutes passed and the night grew colder, he made his way back to his patrol car. The city around him seemed quiet, almost unaware of what had just happened. It felt strange, knowing that while he was here, doing what he could to help, life was just continuing for everyone else, oblivious to the struggles that so many people, especially children, were facing every day. He sat in the driver's seat of his patrol car, staring out at the street ahead. His mind kept returning to the girl. How long had she been living this way? How many nights had she spent alone, wandering the streets, unsure where her next meal would come from or where she would sleep? He could only imagine how frightening and lonely it must have felt for her. As a father himself, he couldn't imagine his own child going through something like that. The thought was unbearable. The radio crackled to life, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a routine call, nothing out of the ordinary, but his mind kept wandering back to the girl. The officers and social workers who had taken over were doing their part, making sure she was safe. But still, there was something about her that lingered with him. He felt like he had seen something in her eyes, a quiet plea for help that went beyond what she said. He had dealt with many difficult situations, but this one felt personal. Helping people was part of his job, of course, but this situation had shaken him in a way he hadn't expected. It wasn't just about being a police officer. It was about being human. He had been trained to stay calm and professional, to assess situations and take action. But when you're face to face with someone so vulnerable, it becomes hard to keep your emotions in check. The officer knew he couldn't save everyone, but he had done something today. He had been there for her in her moment of need. His thoughts shifted to the girl's future. What would happen to her? Would she find a place to stay? Would she ever feel safe again? It was a bitter reality, but he knew that the system wasn't perfect. There were so many children like her, living in poverty, in unsafe situations, struggling to survive. It wasn't enough for one officer to make a difference. It required a community-wide effort. As the night wore on, the officer drove through the quiet streets, his mind still unsettled. He kept thinking about how many other children might be out there, facing the same hardships, the same fears. How many other families were falling through the cracks. It wasn't just a problem for one neighborhood or one city. It was a nationwide issue. And while he couldn't solve all of it on his own, he could make sure that when he encountered someone in need, he would do everything in his power to help. Later that evening, the officer was able to get in touch with the social worker who had taken over the case. He was relieved to hear that the girl was being taken to a safe shelter and that there were plans in place to get her the help she needed. There were also resources available to help her mother, who was struggling with her own health issues. The officer felt a small sense of relief, knowing that the girl wasn't going to be left alone anymore. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a step in the right direction. Even so, as he lay in bed later that night, the image of the little girl on the swing stayed with him. It reminded him of why he did what he did, why he became a police officer in the first place. It wasn't about the uniform or the badge. It was about making sure people didn't feel invisible, especially those who needed help the most. In that moment, he understood more than ever that every small act of kindness mattered. It wasn't about changing the whole world at once, but about doing the right thing for one person at a time. The next day, the officer couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. He had done what he thought was right, helped the young girl when she needed it most, and made sure she was in a safe place. But there was still a sense of unease that lingered with him. It wasn't just the girl's story. It was everything about the situation. The system, while there to help, didn't always provide the stability and support children like her needed. After the social worker took her away, he hadn't been able to stop thinking about what would happen next. Would she truly be okay? Was she really safe now? The officer had seen enough over the years to know that the system wasn't always as perfect as it seemed. Children in situations like the girl's often ended up bouncing from place to place, trying to find some kind of home, but too often, things didn't work out. He had witnessed it countless times. Children ending up in shelters, temporary foster homes, or even worse, left to fend for themselves in the streets. No matter how many resources or good intentions there were, it never seemed like enough. It was a tough reality, and it weighed heavily on his mind. That afternoon, the officer found himself driving past the same playground where he had first found the girl. It was quieter than the day before. The swings swayed gently in the breeze, and the air was crisp. The officer pulled over to the side of the road and parked his car. He sat there for a few moments, staring out at the playground. It wasn't much, but it had been a place of refuge for the girl. A place where she could feel somewhat safe, even if only for a little while. And it reminded him of all the other children who didn't have a safe place to go. The officer got out of the car and walked over to the swings, his boots crunching on the gravel path. He gently pushed one of the swings with his hand, watching it move back and forth. He thought about the girl's face, the way her eyes seemed so tired, like she had seen too much already. He wondered what kind of life she had lived before he found her. How long had she been struggling? How long had she felt lost? The officer had seen a lot in his years of service, but moments like these were different. It was easy to get caught up in the day-to-day grind of the job, responding to calls, dealing with emergencies, and managing the chaos of city life. But every now and then, something would come along that made him stop and think about why he was doing this job in the first place. It wasn't just about arresting people or writing reports. It was about protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. And it was about being there when someone needed help the most. He leaned against one of the posts of the playground, his thoughts still focused on the little girl. Maybe she wouldn't remember him in a few weeks or months, but he would never forget her. She had reminded him of the importance of showing kindness, of taking the time to listen when someone is in need. It wasn't always easy to know what to do in these situations, but he knew that just showing up and doing something could make all the difference. As he stood there, the officer began to feel a bit more at peace. Maybe the system wasn't perfect, but he had done what he could. The girl was safe now, and that was what mattered. It wasn't much, but it was enough for today. He knew there would be more challenges ahead, but for now, he had made a small difference in someone's life. And for him, that was the most important part of the job. Before getting back into his car, the officer took one last look at the playground. The swings were still swaying in the wind, but now they didn't seem as empty. There was hope in them, a reminder that even in the toughest times, there was still the possibility of a better future. It might take time, but as long as people cared, there was always a chance. And the officer was determined to do his part. The days following the encounter with the little girl felt long for the officer. It wasn't that his work had slowed down. He still had plenty of calls to respond to, plenty of tasks to complete, but his mind kept returning to her. He found himself thinking about her face, her quiet voice, and the sadness in her eyes. It was a sadness that felt so deep, one that no child should ever have to bear. He often wondered where she was now and if she was doing okay. It wasn't just about making sure she was safe at the moment. It was about what happened to her after that. The officer knew that life wasn't always kind to children like her. There were so many factors working against them: poverty, unstable homes, lack of support, and it made him feel powerless at times. Even though he had done what he could, he realized that his actions alone wouldn't fix everything. Still, he held on to the hope that the girl's situation would improve. She deserved a chance at a better life, a life where she didn't have to face the world alone. One afternoon, while responding to a call, the officer found himself in the same neighborhood again. It wasn't the same spot where he had found the girl, but it was close enough. As he drove down the street, he noticed a group of children playing in a nearby park. Their laughter filled the air, a sound that seemed so pure and full of joy. The officer couldn't help but smile at the sight. It was the kind of sound that reminded him that, despite all the hardships, childhood could still be full of moments of happiness. He parked his car nearby and decided to take a quick walk. As he approached the park, he saw the children running around, playing tag, and sharing snacks. The officer watched them for a while, taking in the simple joy they seemed to find in just being together. It was a stark contrast to what he had seen a few days earlier, but it reminded him of something important. There was still good in the world. There was still hope. As he stood there, watching the children, the officer couldn't help but think about the girl again. He wondered if she had ever known the carefree joy of running through a park with friends. Had she ever had a moment where she didn't have to worry about where she would sleep or whether she would be safe? He hoped that, one day, she would. He hoped that her future would be different, that she would find stability, and that she would never have to feel the way she had felt when he found her alone in that playground. Later that day, the officer received a phone call from the social worker who had been handling the girl's case. He was relieved to hear that she was settling in at the shelter and that her mother was receiving the help she needed as well. The social worker told him that they were working on finding a more permanent solution, one that would give the girl a better chance at a stable life. While there were still challenges ahead, The officer felt a sense of hope. It wasn't the perfect outcome, but it was progress. As the officer hung up the phone, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. He had been a small part of the girl's journey, but it was clear that there were many people out there working together to give her a better future. The system wasn't perfect, but it was capable of making a difference, and that gave him hope. That night, as the officer sat down for dinner with his own family, he couldn't help but feel a little lighter. The world could be tough, and sometimes it seemed like there was so much wrong with it. But there were still moments that reminded him of the good. Moments when people stepped in to help, when a small act of kindness made all the difference. And for him, that was enough to keep going. He knew that his work wasn't done. There would be more children in need, more families facing difficult times. But he also knew that as long as he continued to care, continued to show up for the people who needed him, he was doing his part. It wasn't about changing the whole world at once. It was about making sure that, one person at a time, the world became a little bit better. And that was something worth fighting for. Weeks passed, and the officer went back to his usual routine. There were always new calls to respond to, new challenges to face, and new people to help. But in the quiet moments, his thoughts would still wander back to the young girl. It was a lingering feeling that he couldn't quite shake. She had come into his life for just a brief moment, yet she had left a mark on his heart. He couldn't stop thinking about what she had been through and how, for the first time in a long time, she had experienced some sense of safety. One evening, as he was finishing his shift, the officer drove through the neighborhood where he had found the girl. It was one of those moments when he wasn't on a call, just winding down from the long day. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the streets. The world felt quiet and peaceful, as if everything had slowed down just a little. He turned a corner and saw a familiar face in the distance. It was the same park where he had seen the children playing that day. A group of kids were running around again, their laughter filling the air, just as it had before. The officer smiled, feeling a sense of calm wash over him. It was the kind of moment that reminded him why he did what he did. But then, just as he was about to drive past, something caught his eye. He saw a young girl standing near the swings, looking around like she was searching for something. The officer's heart skipped a beat. It was her, the same girl he had helped weeks ago. She looked different now, cleaner, more at ease, with a smile that seemed to say she was doing better. But still, something in her eyes told him she hadn't forgotten. He pulled his car over to the side of the road and got out, walking slowly toward her. She saw him coming and hesitated for a moment, but then her face brightened, and she walked over to meet him. "Hey there," the officer said, his voice warm but calm. "It's good to see you." The girl looked up at him with a smile. "I remember you," she said softly. "You helped me." The officer nodded. "I'm glad to see you're doing okay. How have things been going?" The girl looked down at her shoes for a moment, then back up at him. "It's better now. I'm staying in a safe place. And I have a bed to sleep in. I don't have to worry anymore." The officer felt a wave of relief. It wasn't the perfect solution, but it was so much better than what she had been through before. She had found some stability, something that every child deserved. And that made him feel like the small effort he had put in had been worth it. "That's really good to hear," he said with a smile. "I'm proud of you. You're really strong." The girl nodded, her smile growing a little wider. "I don't feel scared anymore. I feel safe. And I know I can make it now." The officer could feel his emotions starting to swell. Hearing her speak like that, knowing that she was starting to believe in her own strength, was enough to remind him why his job mattered. It wasn't just about doing what was expected or following protocols. It was about being there for someone when they needed it the most, offering them a glimpse of hope when everything else seemed uncertain. "I'm happy for you," the officer said, kneeling down so they were eye level. "You deserve to be happy and safe." The girl's eyes glistened, but she held back her tears. She wasn't a little girl anymore, not the same one he had found alone in the playground. She was stronger now. Thank you, she said quietly, her voice full of gratitude. I'll never forget what you did for me. The officer smiled, standing up again. You take care of yourself, okay? If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to ask. As he turned to leave, he felt something inside him shift. He had done his job that day, more than just enforcing the law. He had made a difference. It wasn't the end of the story, and there was still so much work to be done. But seeing that girl standing there, strong and hopeful, was a reminder that sometimes all it took was one person to help another. He got back into his car and drove away, his heart a little lighter than before. The world wasn't perfect, but in that moment, he felt like it was just a little bit better. And that, for him, was enough to keep going. As long as there were people who cared, there would always be a chance for change. The officer continued his work, but something had changed within him. Every call he responded to, every person he helped, seemed to carry a bit more weight now. His perspective had shifted. He had always cared about the people he helped, but now he found himself thinking more deeply about the people behind the calls. The young girl he had met weeks ago had left an impression on him that wouldn't fade. Her smile, her strength, her journey, they had all reminded him of why he had chosen to be a police officer in the first place, to help, to serve, and to make a difference in people's lives. A few weeks later, the officer found himself in the same neighborhood once again. It wasn't a call he had responded to. He was just driving by, as he often did when his shift was winding down. This time, though, something felt different. There was a sense of familiarity in the air, as if the streets had a way of pulling him back to places he needed to be. He decided to take a small detour and parked near the playground where he had first seen the girl. The swings were empty now, swaying gently in the wind. The playground looked just as it had before, peaceful, but with an air of quiet solitude. The officer sat in his car for a few moments, staring out at the scene. It had been a while since he'd seen the girl, but he still carried the memory of her with him. Just as he was about to start his engine and move on, something caught his attention. He saw a group of children across the street, playing in the park, and there, among them, was the young girl he had helped. She was laughing and running with the other kids, looking completely at ease. She had made friends, and for the first time in a long time, she seemed like a child again. The officer watched her for a few moments, a warm feeling spreading through him. He decided to get out of his car and walk over to the park. As he approached, the girl spotted him right away. She waved excitedly, her face lighting up when she saw him. "Hey," she called out, running toward him. "I didn't expect to see you again." The officer smiled as he walked over to her. "It's good to see you again, too," he said, his voice gentle. "How's everything going?" She grinned, her energy contagious. "It's great. I have a new school, and I've made a lot of friends. And I have a place to stay where I don't have to worry. Everything's so much better now." The officer felt a lump form in his throat. Hearing her talk like that, with such confidence and joy, was a relief. He had wondered how she was doing, but now, seeing her so happy and settled, he knew that everything he had hoped for her was coming true. It wasn't just about finding her a safe place to stay. It was about helping her rebuild her life, step by step. And hearing her speak about it with such hope was more than he could have asked for. "That's wonderful," the officer said, crouching down to her level. "I'm really proud of you. You've come a long way." She shrugged, her smile still wide. "I couldn't have done it without help, but I'm doing it now, you know." The officer nodded, feeling a sense of pride in her accomplishments. "You're a really strong kid. I'm glad you're doing so well." They talked for a little longer, about her new school, the friends she'd had made, and the small things she was starting to enjoy again. It was clear to the officer that she had found her way. It hadn't been easy, but she was slowly piecing her life back together. As the conversation came to a close, the officer stood up and took a step back. "I'm happy to see you doing so well," he said, his voice sincere. "You keep going, okay? You're going to do great things." The girl gave him a big hug, surprising him with her warmth and gratitude. "Thank you for everything," she whispered before turning and running back to her friends. The officer stood there for a moment, watching her rejoin the other kids, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. He had done his part, but it was her strength, her resilience, that had carried her through. It wasn't just about offering help. It was about making sure that help led to something lasting, something that allowed her to thrive. As he walked back to his car, the officer's heart was full. It wasn't just about being an officer of the law. It was about being a part of someone's story, even if only for a moment. And in that moment, he had made a difference. Driving away, he thought about how, in a world full of challenges, there was still hope. There were still children like her who needed help, and there were still people willing to make a difference. He didn't know what the future held, but he was certain of one thing. As long as he could, he would continue to show up for those who needed him. The world might be tough, but there was always a chance for things to get better, one small step at a time. A few months passed, and life in the officer's world moved on. He continued his work, dealing with emergencies, calls, and routine tasks, but something had shifted in him. The girl he had helped months ago was still on his mind. He thought about her progress and how far she had come. There was a quiet sense of hope that he carried with him, a reminder that even small acts of kindness could lead to big changes. One evening, while on patrol, the officer found himself driving down a familiar street. It wasn't the same neighborhood where he had met the girl, but it was close enough. The weather had grown colder, and the holiday season was fast approaching. It was the kind of time when people began to feel a little more reflective, a little more aware of the struggles others might be going through. The officer's thoughts naturally drifted to her. It was hard not to wonder how she was doing now, whether she had kept up her progress, or if she was still facing challenges. He made a decision that day to check on her, just to see how she was doing. He didn't expect anything dramatic, no great revelation, but he just wanted to know if she was okay. After all, his job wasn't just about responding to emergencies. It was about making sure people, especially kids, had a better chance at a future, even if it was one small step at a time. The officer parked his car a little ways down the street, not wanting to make his visit feel like an official check-in. He didn't want to show up as just another figure in uniform. He wanted to be there as someone who cared, someone who had seen her struggles and wanted to see her succeed. As he walked toward the community center, which he knew the girl occasionally visited, he noticed the familiar faces of the neighborhood. There were people talking, laughing, and going about their business. The streets seemed calm, but the officer could tell there was always a layer of hustle and survival under the surface. He knew the reality that many people faced. Life could be tough, especially for kids without a stable home. The community center was a small building, but it was a lifeline for many in the neighborhood. It offered resources, activities, and a place for kids to go when they needed a safe space. The officer stepped inside, greeted by a few familiar faces from past visits, and asked the staff if they had seen the young girl recently. "Oh yes, she's been doing great," one of the staff members said, a smile lighting up her face. "She's come a long way. She's really been getting involved in our after-school program and even helping out with some of the younger kids." The officer felt a sense of relief wash over him. It wasn't just that she was doing okay. It was that she was thriving. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was learning, growing, and finding her place in a community that cared. It was more than he had hoped for, and it reminded him of the impact a little help could have on someone's future. "I'm so glad to hear that," the officer said with a smile. "She deserves every chance to succeed." The staff member nodded, her face filled with warmth. "She's come a long way, and it's really thanks to the support she's had. She's strong, and we're doing everything we can to help her continue to move forward." The officer thanked her and left the center with a heart full of hope. He knew that not every child in the neighborhood had the same resources or support, but knowing that one child had found a path to stability made him feel like all the effort had been worth it. It wasn't just about helping in the moment. It was about setting someone on a path that would lead them to a better life. As the officer walked back to his car, he took one last look at the neighborhood. He could see the challenges people faced, but he could also see the strength and resilience in the community. The little girl was just one example of how a little bit of kindness and support could change someone's life. That evening, as the officer drove home, he reflected on the road ahead. There would always be more work to do, more children in need, and more struggles to face. But he knew that his efforts, no matter how small they seemed at times, mattered. It wasn't about fixing everything at once. It was about making a difference, one step at a time. And so, the sense of purpose, the officer drove home, ready to face whatever the next day would bring. Because, no matter how challenging life got, he knew that as long as he cared, he could help someone else find their way through it. As the months passed, the officer's sense of purpose only grew stronger. Every day brought new challenges, new people to help, and more situations where he could make a difference. But the young girl he had helped months ago stayed in his thoughts, reminding him of why he chose to become a police officer in the first place. It wasn't just about the law. It was about helping people when they needed it most, offering them a chance to rebuild their lives one step at a time. One chilly evening, the officer found himself back in the neighborhood once again. The air was crisp, and the streets were quieter than usual. The sun was beginning to set, casting a soft glow across the city. As he drove through familiar roads, his mind wandered, and he thought back to the day when he had first met the girl in the playground. He remembered how she had looked lost and afraid, with no one to turn to. But he also remembered how, despite everything she had been through, she had found the strength to keep going. The officer made a decision. He wanted to check in on her again. He didn't have an official reason to visit. He simply wanted to see how she was doing, to make sure she was still on the right path. It wasn't about paperwork or making a record of his visit. It was about showing her that someone cared, that someone was still thinking about her and rooting for her success. He parked near the community center, the place where she had spent so much time. Walking through the doors, he was greeted by a few familiar faces. The center had been a place of refuge for many kids, offering support, education, and safety. It was a place where children could grow, learn, and feel valued. The officer had always respected the work they did there, but today, he was more focused on the girl he had helped. "Hi there," he said, smiling as he approached one of the staff members. "Is she around?" "Oh, she's just finishing up with a group of kids," the staff member replied. "She's been doing great, really turning things around. She's even started helping out with some more younger programs." The officer's heart lifted. It was more than he had hoped for. The girl wasn't just surviving, she was thriving. She had found a sense of belonging, a place where she could contribute, learn, and grow. He had always known she had the potential for greatness, but now it seemed like she was finally beginning to realize it herself. "I'm really glad to hear that," the officer said, his voice full of pride. "She's a strong one." The staff member nodded. "Absolutely. She's come a long way, and we're all really proud of her. We'll continue to support her however we can." The officer thanked them, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. He knew that it was the girl's own strength that had led her to this point, but the community center had played a big role in giving her the resources and support she needed. It was a team effort, and he felt honored to have been a part of it, even in a small way. As he walked outside, he spotted the girl across the street. She was laughing with a group of friends, her face filled with joy. She had a lightness in her step, a confidence that had been absent the first time they met. It was clear that she was no longer the scared, lost child he had found months ago. She was becoming the person she was always meant to be. The officer waved to her, and she saw him immediately. Her face lit up as she ran toward him, her smile wide and full of energy. "Hey, it's so good to see you," she called out. The officer grinned. "It's good to see you too. How's everything going? Everything's going awesome, she replied. I've got good friends now, I'm doing well in school, and I'm not scared anymore. I feel like I'm finally in control of my life. Her words brought a lump to the officer's throat. It was exactly what he had hoped for her. She wasn't just surviving. She was living, thriving, and becoming the person she had always been capable of becoming. He had helped her take the first step, but she had taken the rest of the journey on her own. You've come so far, the officer said, his voice filled with admiration. I'm really proud of you. She beamed. Thank you for believing in me. You made me feel like I could do this. The officer's heart swelled with pride. She had found her strength, and now she was walking down a path full of possibilities. As they talked for a while longer, the officer couldn't help but feel a deep sense of fulfillment. This was what it was all about, the small moments that led to big changes, the quiet victories that made all the hard work worth it. Seeing the girl happy, confident, and on her way to a brighter future was the best reward he could have asked for. When it was time to leave, the officer gave her one last smile. Take care of yourself, all right? I know you've got a bright future ahead of you.